Omar was torn between the highs of Friday nights out and the calm of Friday prayers. He was tired of feeling empty. Every Friday night, the laughter and parties left him feeling more disconnected. He knew something had to change, but did he have the courage to find his way back? Omar felt the familiar pang of guilt creeping in as he returned home from another Friday night out. He was surrounded by friends every weekend, laughing and living it up, but something inside him felt hollow. He'd moved far from the spiritual peace he once knew, and in a moment of clarity, he wondered if it was time to make a change. Omar was a young professional in his mid-20s, working hard during the week, putting in long hours at the office, and striving to make a name for himself. He was ambitious, focused, and determined to succeed. But as soon as the weekend came, all that drive seemed to fizzle away. His friends knew him as the one who would never say no to a night out, a few drinks, a few laughs, anything to escape the stress of the week. After moving away from his family to start his career, the sense of freedom had initially been exhilarating. Omar could finally do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. But that freedom came with a price. Friday nights turned into an escape from the stress of work, from the pressure to fit in, and from a deeper, unacknowledged sense of emptiness. With every night out, he laughed a little harder to mask the growing void he felt inside. He would come home late, sometimes just as the far adhan began playing softly on his phone. Lying in bed, still in his clothes from the night before, he would feel a deep unease settle in his chest. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was a sense that he was losing a part of himself. He remembered the peace he used to feel when he was more connected to his faith, when Friday nights meant preparing for Jumu'ah prayer rather than recovering from a hangover. He was stuck between two worlds, one that gave him temporary highs and one that promised lasting peace. But the more he chased the highs, the further away that peace seemed to drift. The emptiness was becoming harder to ignore, and Omar was beginning to wonder if it was time to make a change. The pressure on Omar was building. His friends had started planning their next big outing, an entire weekend away at a rented cabin, full of late-night parties, drinking, and a break from the mundane. To them, it was the ultimate way to relax after a grueling workweek. To Omar, though, it felt different this time. He remembered his mother's words during their last phone call. "Don't forget your roots, Omar. Remember who you are." She had been gentle, but her concern was clear. She could sense that Omar was drifting, losing the values she and his father had instilled in him. And now, as the weekend approached, Omar found himself feeling torn. He didn't want to miss out, to be the one friend that says no and gets left out of plans in the future. But something deep inside whispered that he needed to reconnect, with himself, with his faith, with that calm he used to feel when he prioritized his prayers. The group chat was buzzing. His friends were excitedly planning everything. Who would bring the drinks, what games they would play, what time they would hit the road. Every message that popped up only increased the tension Omar felt. His friends couldn't understand why he was hesitating. To them, it was simple. Unwind, have fun, let loose. But to Omar, it felt like he was standing at a crossroads, and each option pulled him in a different direction. Omar also knew that saying no wasn't just about missing out on this one trip. He feared that his friends would start seeing him as the boring one, or the one who changed. He had seen it happen to others before. People who chose a different path, only to find themselves gradually pushed out of the group. He didn't want that to happen to him. He valued his friendships, the memories they had made, the laughter they shared. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the growing emptiness inside him. He remembered a time when his weekends felt different, when Fridays were spent with his family, filled with warmth and a sense of purpose. Back then, he would prepare for Jumu'ah prayer with his father, feeling a sense of connection that carried him through the week. Those memories seemed like a lifetime ago, but the longing for that sense of peace was stronger than ever. He missed the feeling of being spiritually fulfilled, of knowing that his actions aligned with his beliefs. His friends kept nudging him to join, not understanding why he hesitated. "Come on, Omar, it's just a weekend," they would say. The more they pushed, the more conflicted he felt. It wasn't easy explaining the internal tug-of-war he faced, the way his heart felt torn between wanting to belong and wanting to be true to himself. When they asked, "What's the big deal, bro? It's just a weekend. Come on." Omar simply smiled and said, "I'll think about it," but the tension within him kept growing. He wanted to belong, but he was starting to wonder what he was losing in the process. It wasn't just about one weekend. It was about the direction his life was taking. Each choice, each party, each night out seemed to pull him further from the person he wanted to be. He began questioning whether the temporary fun was worth the long-term cost. Was it worth sacrificing the peace he once knew? Was it worth feeling disconnected from his faith, his roots, his family? Deep down, Omar knew he couldn't keep going like this. The emptiness was no longer something he could ignore, and he realized that if he wanted to change, he needed to take a step, no matter how hard it seemed. The challenge wasn't just about skipping a trip, it was about choosing a different path for his life, one that brought him closer to who he truly wanted to be. As the weekend approached, Omar felt the weight of his decision growing heavier. The memories of Friday nights spent in serenity with his family kept flooding back. Those nights were filled with a sense of stability, a rhythm that anchored him. They were not just about religious rituals, but about belonging to something greater. He missed that. One evening, after a particularly draining day at work, Omar decided to call someone he hadn't spoken to in a while, his cousin Ahmed. Ahmed was more than family. He was a role model. He was the same age as Omar, but their lives had taken different paths. While Omar had slowly drifted from his faith, Ahmed had clung to it, and it showed in his sense of peace and purpose. Every time Omar scrolled through his social media and saw Ahmed surrounded by his friends at the mosque or doing charity work, he couldn't help but feel a pang of longing. "Hey, Ahmed," Omar began, trying to sound casual, but the hesitance in his voice was evident. After a few minutes of catching up, Omar finally allowed himself to be vulnerable. "I feel stuck, man. I mean, I've got great friends, I've got a good job, but something just doesn't feel right anymore. I feel like I'm drifting, and I don't know how to get back." There was a pause on the line, and Omar could almost hear Ahmed's thoughtful nod. "Omar, I know what you're saying," Ahmed said quietly. "It's not easy. We're constantly trying to fit into a world that doesn't always match our values. But listen, do you remember the peace we used to feel when we prayed far together during summer breaks? That feeling of starting the day on the right foot, like nothing could go wrong? You're looking for that peace, and it's still there. You just have to reconnect with it." Ahmed's words struck a chord deep within Omar. He remembered those early morning prayers, the cool breeze, the stillness of dawn, and the feeling of being in sync with something greater. Ahmed invited Omar to come to the mosque for Jumu'ah that week, reassuring him that he wasn't alone. Ahmed's words were a reminder that faith wasn't just about rituals. It was about community, about belonging to something larger than oneself. "Why don't you come this Friday?" Ahmed suggested. "I'll be there, and I know a lot of the brothers would be happy to see you. You might be surprised how many people are feeling the same way you are, but you'll never know unless you take that first step." Ahmed also shared a verse from the Quran that had always given him strength. "Whoever places his trust in Allah, He alone is sufficient for him." Quran 65:3. It was a simple reminder, yet powerful. It spoke directly to Omar's fears and uncertainties. The call ended with a sense of hope. Ahmed made Omar feel that change was possible, but only if he had the courage to take the first step. On the night before the trip, Omar found himself sitting in his room, staring at his phone. The group chat was buzzing, his friends excitedly discussing the weekend plans, the games, the drinks, the late nights. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. A part of him still wanted to go, to not be the one who backed out. But then he thought of the mosque, of Ahmed, of the feeling he had been longing for, the feeling of being anchored, of being at peace. Omar took a deep breath and typed, "Guys, I think I'm gonna sit this one out." He pressed send before he could change his mind. He could almost feel the silence that followed. A few moments later, the replies came in, ranging from "What's wrong, bro?" to "You're really gonna miss out." Omar's heart pounded, but alongside the anxiety, there was also a sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, he had chosen something different, something that felt right. Later that night, Ahmed sent him a message. "Proud of you, cuz. See you tomorrow for Jumu'ah." Omar smiled, feeling a warmth that had been missing for so long. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he was finally taking a step towards the person he wanted to be. Friday arrived. Omar woke up with a sense of both nervousness and anticipation. His friends were still sending messages, urging him to reconsider and join them at the last minute. He could see the pictures they were already sharing, roadside coffee stops, excited selfies, and the beginnings of what promised to be an unforgettable weekend. A small part of him almost gave in to the fear of missing out. But Omar remembered Ahmed's words and the peace he used to feel when he put his trust in Allah. Determined not to back down, he got dressed, put on his best clothes, and headed to the mosque for Jumu'ah prayer. It had been a long time since he'd attended, and his heart pounded as he stepped inside. As he entered the mosque, he was greeted by familiar faces. People from his childhood, neighbors he hadn't seen in years. Ahmed was waiting for him near the entrance, and his face lit up when he saw Omar. Ahmed gave him a tight hug and said, "I knew you'd make it, bro." The warmth of that welcome made Omar feel instantly at ease. The khutbah began, and the imam spoke about the importance of returning to Allah, no matter how far we think we've strayed. He emphasized a hadith that hit Omar deeply: "Whoever comes to me walking, I will come to him running, Sahih Muslim." As the imam's words echoed through the mosque, Omar felt a lump in his throat, his eyes stinging as he realized that despite everything, Allah was still there, waiting for him. It was as if the imam was speaking directly to him, reminding him that it was never too late to come back. During the prayer, Omar stood shoulder to shoulder with Ahmed, surrounded by others who, like him, were seeking something greater. The feeling of unity, of being part of something bigger than himself, was overwhelming. As he recited Surah Al-Fatiha, he felt a wave of calm wash over him, a peace that he hadn't felt in years. The noise and chaos of the past few weeks began to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity and purpose. When the prayer ended, Omar sat quietly for a few moments, his hands raised in dua. He asked Allah for guidance, for strength, and for the ability to stay on this path. He realized that the emptiness he had been feeling wasn't because he lacked fun or friends. It was because he had drifted away from his true self, from his faith. And now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was coming back. After the prayer, Ahmed put an arm around Omar's shoulder, and they walked out of the mosque together. The sun was shining, and Omar felt lighter, as if the burden of trying to fit into a world that wasn't meant for him had finally been lifted. Ahmed looked at him and said, "See, bro? This is what we need. To just take it step by step and remember what really matters." As they walked through the mosque courtyard, a few other brothers came up to greet Omar, welcoming him back. They chatted for a while, talking about upcoming community events and catching up on old times. For the first time, Omar felt like he belonged, not because he was trying to fit in, but because he was being true to himself. Omar smiled, feeling that perhaps, for the first time in a long while, he was finally headed in the right direction. The fear of missing out had been replaced by a deeper fulfillment, one that came from reconnecting with his faith and his community. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but he was ready to face them, one step at a time. In the weeks that followed, Omar began to make significant changes. It wasn't an instant transformation, but rather a series of small, deliberate steps that gradually brought him closer to where he wanted to be. He still spent time with his friends, still enjoyed socializing, but he was more selective about where he invested his energy. When invitations came for late-night parties or events that didn't sit well with him, Omar politely declined. Instead, he began suggesting alternatives: hiking trips, going to the gym, or even just gathering for dinner where the environment was relaxed and uplifting. He was surprised by how many of his friends were open to these new activities, and some even seemed relieved. Friday prayers became the cornerstone of his week. Every Friday, Omar would wake up with a sense of anticipation, knowing that Jumu'ah was waiting for him, a moment to reconnect, to pause, and to remember what truly mattered. The mosque became more than a place of worship. It became a sanctuary, a source of community and support. The more he attended, the more familiar faces he saw, and soon, the mosque felt like an extension of his family. He would stay back after prayers, chatting with the brothers, sometimes volunteering to help with events or just sitting quietly to reflect. Omar also found himself drawn to learning more about his faith. He started attending a weekly study circle at the mosque, something he never thought he would have time for. But as he sat with others, discussing verses from the Quran and the lessons of the Prophet, peace be upon him, Omar felt his heart opening up. It wasn't just about knowledge. It was about understanding how to live a life that was meaningful and connected to something greater. He realized that the contentment he had been searching for wasn't in the loud, crowded rooms of his past weekends. It was in these quiet moments of reflection and learning. There were still challenges, of course. Not all of his friends understood the changes he was making. Some drifted away, unable to relate to this new version of Omar. It hurt, but Omar knew that it was part of the journey. He was no longer willing to compromise his inner peace for the sake of fitting in. And for every friend that drifted away, there were others who stayed. Friends who saw the positive changes in him and respected his choices. Some even began asking questions about faith, about what was drawing Omar closer to the mosque, and he was happy to share his journey with them. One afternoon, after Jummah, a young man approached Omar as he sat in the mosque, deep in thought. "Hey, I recognize you from college," the young man said with a hesitant smile. "I never thought I'd see you here." Omar looked up, surprised but pleased. "Yeah, it took me a while to find my way back," he replied, "but it feels good to be here." They ended up talking for almost an hour, sharing experiences, and Omar realized just how many people out there were struggling with the same feelings of disconnect and longing that he had faced. The more Omar connected with his community, the more he realized he was not alone. The struggle to balance faith with the demands of modern life was something many faced, and it was in sharing these struggles that they found strength. Slowly, by prioritizing his faith, Omar found that the peace he had been chasing in the wrong places was now becoming a part of his everyday life. He no longer felt torn between two worlds. Instead, he was building a life that honored both his ambitions and his beliefs. Omar learned that true contentment comes not from seeking the approval of others but from staying true to oneself and connecting deeply with Allah. He realized that it was not about perfection but about intention, taking small, meaningful steps towards being a better version of himself. His journey was far from over, but he knew he was on the right path, one that brought him closer to his Creator with every step. If Omar's journey inspired you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire us to reconnect with our faith and find balance in our everyday lives.